Welcome to the Praxis Report. We are the podcast where theory meets practice, where we dissect current events and politics from a revolutionary perspective. I am your co-host, Jonathan Brown. Hi
I'm your
there.
other co-host, William Barth.
Hi there, William. And today, I am going to be picking William's brain. William is a PhD and an excellent, brilliant scholar with a doctorate from Oxford, where he wrote a brilliant book called "On Cultural Rights: The Equality of Nations and the Minority Legal Tradition." So, Will is an expert on minority rights and the question of statehood. Now, what we're going to talk about today is the issue of how states are formed, what is the state, the history of how states come into being, particularly in relationship to Palestine. But before that, Will, before we get into the topic, could you briefly just maybe tell the listeners what your book was about and what your work on cultural rights and minority legal rights was about?
Certainly, John, but I would like to make clear to the listeners that I did have to pay a few dollars to say all that nice things about me. But
Oh, of
thank you for that.
course.
No, no, just kidding, just kidding. But those are very complimentary things you said. Thank you very much. Um, Well, my book really started as my doctoral thesis in the Department of Politics and International Relations in Oxford in the United Kingdom, where I got my DPhil, which is the equivalent of a PhD. Oxford University is an ancient school, as you may know, and
Right.
they do things quite different because of their ancient traditions. They do things different than the rest of the world, and so their degree at the doctoral level is called a DPhil, a Doctor of Philosophy, and it's a degree that's taken by research largely, by research only. So it's a little different system than the American system. You are assigned a what they call a tutor, and you have a one-on-one relationship during your whole period of study at the university with basically one sort of guide or supervisor or tutor. And that one-on-one relationship is what guides your years of research towards your doctoral degree. So that was the system I was studied in or trained under. And again, it's an ancient school with ancient traditions that carry forth even into the modern day. So they do things quite different than we do them here in the United States. But it was a wonderful experience. And the school I attended in Oxford was a school of international politics, St. Anthony's College at Oxford. And the student body the students at St. Anthony's are the students from every state or every country in the world. So you had students from Africa and students from Asia, students, of course, from the United States and throughout Europe, and just throughout the entire world. And every time an issue came up, just having international discussions with all the students gave you quite a different perspective
Mhm.
of issues than we would have here in the United States. So it was just a sort of an idyllic environment in that regard. And it was ideal also for my research topic. Um, Again, not to go, not to waste too much time, but my topic in school was the topic of what today you would call identity politics, wokeism. Back when I was doing my studies around the year 2000 through 2005, the issue was called multiculturalism. So it's a sort of a vague topic. It's a topic that covers a range of policies about diversity. Here in the United States, we have policies like affirmative action, English or as a second language. Um, uh, Also, it goes to religious ideas on diversity. Christian scientists who don't want to use certain medical practices, should they be allowed to deny certain medical treatments to their children that could be life-saving? It goes to religions. Should religious groups be allowed to engage in ancient practices that are anti-modern, kosher laws, the way we kill animals in ancient religions, are those something that should be tolerated in modern society? Sikhs who wear knives on their clothing as a religious symbol, should that be permitted? So you have this range of religious and ethnic sort of characteristics, and we have these policies called multiculturalism to diversity, with the big question being, should we accommodate minority groups, be they religious or linguistic or ethnic uh, and racial, with their particular cultural characteristics? In other words, should we allow them to exercise their cultural practices and enjoy them and express them? And if so, to what degree? And then how does this relate to a larger problem, which is the problem of nation states and war itself? Because as President Woodrow Wilson once remarked, nothing in the world threatens the peace and the peaceful coexistence of the world than the problem of minorities and our treatment of minority groups. And I think that's a long way of getting into that is exactly what we're witnessing here today with the establishment of a new nation called Palestine. So we'll get into that as we discuss and further.
Okay, great. That is an excellent overview of your history at Oxford and the minority legal tradition that you wrote this brilliant thesis on. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic ideas of statehood and state formation. So if you could just describe for us, what is the historical basis for the formation of states? So, what are some of the key factors, like economic factors, political factors,
Right.
cultural factors that allow for the emergence of states?
Right. The, uh, the idea, one of the interesting points in studying the history of states is that, you know, we tend to think of nation states like Russia or Italy or Spain or France as these entities like the sun and the moon and the stars, like they were always there. Uh,
Right.
but but that's not true. They weren't always there. What you have in human history is this sort of evolution between empires and kingdoms, and then the eventual breakdown of empires into national states. So what you had, for example, in Europe was you had first the Roman Empire, and then later rule by the Church of Rome, where all of Europe was literally under the jurisdiction of the holy of the Pope in Rome.
Hmm.
And eventually that empire, you might call it, broke down. There was a schism in the church. You had the divergence between the Greek and Russian Orthodox Church splitting from the church in Rome, and then later also the British the British King Henry, who wanted a divorce and he couldn't get it from
Right.
the Pope, so he had to start his own religion, Protestantism, in Great Britain. So the system began to break down, and a classical treaty called the Treaty of Westphalia, I believe around the mid 1600s, was signed, and you had to begin the breakdown of this sort of empire, this Catholic empire out of Rome, into individual states where each king and the religion of each king would determine the religion of the state that the king ruled over, or the province, and eventually the emergence of, over time, national states like France, like Italy, like Spain, and so forth. So So it's probably more of a evolution between empire and states than it is nation states, something that has always been with us. Now here's the modern day problem. The problem which leads to war is we have this problem with minority groups, and that problem is that there are some, depending on how you study them, 5 to 8,000 minority groups in the world, groups with their own languages, their own cultural practices, their own traditions, and so forth. And you only have what, 100, currently 193 nation states. So you have these 5 to 8,000 groups living in 193 states. And the great question is, in these 193 states, which group is going to control the apparatus of the state? In other words, how is the language of the state going to be determined? How is the educational system of the state going to be determined? What religion is the state going to follow, or is it going to have an official religion? And then you have the emergence of this new phenomena called the civic state, like the United States of America, where we claim to have no minorities. We're all Americans here. We have no minorities. We don't see ourselves as a particular ethno religious or linguistic group. We are Americans, and yet we know that's just not the case, because we, even though we don't have an official language, we have a lingua franca. We speak a form of British English from Europe, which is kind of ironic because we're in America. And if we were in America, we should be speaking one of the indigenous American languages, for Sioux or Cherokee or one of the indigenous languages of the country, as opposed to a European language like British English or even French. And also we had, of course, the problems of segregation and slavery and so forth. So we really, even though we claim to be a civic state, we really were a state controlled by a particular ethno-racial group. You want to call it Anglo-American, but that's changed over time as well, and it continues to change. I've sort of lost my train of thought, but
No, that so picking up from there, we have you answered a great question of the history of the nation state system and the question of minority groups in different states. So I think this is a good segue into the question of Palestine and
correct.
the case of Palestine and the question of Palestinian statehood. So we know that historically, Israel was founded as a state in 1948 by the United Nations through this new form of international law. And you mentioned historical examples like the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s, but today we are governed by this sort of international legal system of the United Nations, which is responsible for partitioning Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And yet the Arab state, the Palestinian state, never came into being. So, could you talk a little bit about how you see this question of minority legal rights, the minority tradition and cultural rights, and how does that apply to the question of Palestinian statehood?
Right. There's a lot to unpack in your question. So I'm going to try to simplify it. What I think we're witnessing here, without getting into the entire history of the Palestinian question, what we're witnessing here is the problem of state creation, or creating states. Again, we talked about thousands of minority groups. We can't have a world system or we could, with each group having a nation and each nation being controlled by a particular group, or we're going to have 5,000 countries in the world as opposed to 193 states. So the problem we're seeing here is a problem of how do we create states? And the sort of quick answer without getting into the history of the United Nations and how it evolves with its contemporary systems, the quick answer is we really don't have a procedure an international legal procedure to create a new country. We do not have one. Now, let me diverge a little bit. We do have a number of legal conventions, and such as the United Nations Charter. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's the largest international human rights convention in the world. Almost, I think every country in the world has signed on to that convention. We also have the International Convention on, I believe it's social, economic, and cultural rights, which the United States has not signed on to, but that is also the second largest international human rights treaty in the world. Now, in all of these conventions, the UN Charter, both the human rights treaties, the sort of highlight or crown jewel of these conventions is the idea of the self-determination of peoples. So even though we have, 5,000 minorities, as many as 8,000 minorities, if you count tribes and clans and things like that,
Right.
we don't have 5,000 peoples. What is a peoples? A peoples is a group, like a minority group, that the international community recognizes as having a right to self-determination. Now, the right to self-determination, it's not an abstract right, but it is a right that can be fulfilled in a number of different ways, including establishing a new country, but not necessarily establishing a new country. So the right, the recognition of a minority group as a peoples gives that group the right to determine how it wants to exercise its right to self-determination. Some want to create a new country. Others, like the Inuit peoples, that's an indigenous group, we used to call them the Eskimos, they didn't want a new country. They wanted a state where they can speak their language, exercise their practices as Eskimos. They're called the ice people. They live in ice, and their houses are made of ice, and they hunt, whale meat, and they have all these very exotic practices that are, very different. It's part of their culture. And so they wanted a country in Canada. They wanted to remain Canadians. They wanted to be a part of the Canadian state, but they wanted to exercise their own cultural practices, religious practices, and linguistic practices. And they established a state called Nunavik in Canada. So that's how that group exercised its right to self-determination. So this is a very difficult question for groups, because sometimes groups don't know how they want to exercise that right. For example, let's look at the Palestinian case. Do Palestinians want a separate state within what was formerly a British colony called the British Mandatory of Palestine, and share it with a group of Jewish people and have a separate state, one Jewish and one largely ethnic Arab, called Palestine? Or maybe they want to remain in Israel and have some sort of autonomous homeland within the larger state of Israel, or maybe some sort of binational arrangement, a common nation with two federated states, one called the State of Israel that protects and promotes the cultural identity of the Jewish peoples, and one called the State of Palestine, which protects and promotes the cultural existence and identity of the Palestinian peoples. So there's a number of approaches we could take to fulfilling this right to self-determination. Now, in the Palestinian case, I should point out that the United Nations, in recognizing a state called Israel, did, in a sense, grant the right of self-determination to the Jewish peoples, recognizing the Jewish peoples as a peoples, entitled to the right of self-determination. Again, how Jews chose to exercise that right, in other words, the early idea during the time of the League of Nations was a Jewish homeland within the former British mandatory called Palestine, a homeland within Palestine. Today, we seem to have completely reversed the question. We're talking about a little homeland for Palestinians within the larger state of Israel, or separated from the state of Israel. But in any event, that's what we're dealing with. And the point I wanted to make about it is this. In each of these conventions and treaties, there's no procedure by which a peoples can fulfill their right of self-determination. In other words, they can't file a claim or an application to the United Nations and say, okay, we're a peoples, be they Palestinians or Basque or Catalans or Tibetans, or what, we're a peoples, and we want our own country. We want our own country. You know, Tibetans, we don't want to be part of China. We want to have Tibet. We have a Tibetan religion. We exercise Tibetan Buddhism. We like to practice it, and we do kung fu and all kinds of stuff. And we want our own country. You know, so we're going to apply to the United Nations and create our. No, there's no procedure for it. There's none. So you have this now. In terms of minority rights, like we'd like to speak our own language, or indigenous groups who want to practice indigenous practices like how they hunt or fish, those groups in certain with regard to certain countries that signed off on these human rights treaties can actually file an application with the Human Rights Council at the United Nations and have their case heard. So the whole thrust or point of international law in this question is taking these minority groups like Palestinians and letting them escape, in a sense, from the nations that host them. Again, be they Palestinians, Catalans, Basque, Tibetans, Native Hawaiians, you know, whatever the group, Quebecois, you know, and let them escape their country to go to the United Nations and tell an international body, we want our own country. And we want you, the international body, to recognize us and help us to establishment. So we're not in what the human rights lawyers call the iron cage, or they call it the golden cage of domestic law. In other words, the Palestinians today live literally incarcerated in a golden cage prison of the state of Israel. They are under Israeli jurisdiction, and they live almost as incarcerated prisoners. I mean, they have no rights to travel. They can't vote. They can't, they have literally no human rights in Israel. I'm talking about, again, to clarify, Palestinians, ethnic Arabs living in Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza. So the idea of international law, since there is no procedure in which this group, Palestinians, can just go to the UN and apply for statehood and say, look, we'd like our own country and just recognize us. Instead, they're trapped in this golden cage of the Israeli domestic law prison. No different than any other peoples or minority group who became peoples in any other country. And countries usually all react the same way. When the Catalans want to have an independent Catalonia in Spain, you know, the Spanish government is going to say, no, you can't take a part of Spain away and start your own country. And Israel, of course, is, you know, completely extinguished any hope for a Palestinian state. As far as the state of Israel, the current regime there said they'll never be a Palestinian state as long as that regime is in power. So there's no procedure. What does that mean? To get to the point, what that means, when there is a lack of law, when there's a lack of a legal procedure, a civilized mechanism by which a peoples can apply for independent nationhood, how do they get it? How do they get a country? Well, when you have no law, what happens? You in legal in jurisprudence, we call it, you have to resort to what lawyers would call self-help. What does that mean? In a word, violence. You have to pick up arms and commit acts of violence to achieve the objective of creating a new nation. And if you create, sadly, in many cases, not all, but in many, if not, I would say most cases, looking at, say, the Republic of Ireland, looking at South Africa, looking at Kenya, looking at state after state that had South Africa again, that had to win statehood, independence from that golden cage. They had to resort to violence. And unfortunately, the historic sort of lesson we've learned, when enough violence is committed, when enough murdering is committed, the state is recognized. I mean, it's a very sad story, but that's what happens when you, in the absence of law, that's what happens. You have the sort of the breakdown of civility, and you have what we have in the Middle East. Now, one other word. The whole history of the nation state system and nationalism has been a history of things like denationalization campaigns, coercive assimilation campaigns, population transfer from World War I to World War II. Numerous examples of entire populations being transferred from one country to another country. Populations exchanges between Bulgaria and Turkey,
Right.
between Greece and Turkey. Muslim populations being exchanged for Christian populations. So, and not only population transfers and denationalization campaigns, but genocides. The Turkish genocide of Armenians, and this has been, and of course the German genocide of European Jewry. So this has been the sort of the result of our nation state system and nationalism. So in that sense, the case of the Palestinians is not totally unique. This is how countries are formed, and I think you have a clip that you can show the viewer of what's happening in the current day today after all of this violence, a likely genocide against the Palestinian people, this so-called, what was it, October 7th terrorist attack by Gazans who somehow broke out of their prison. They're imprisoned in Gaza. You can't, if you're Palestinian, again, I tend to like to help the viewer think about it. Think of them as Arab Israelis who are kept there like in a prison-like condition. Israelis who are denied equal rights because Israel is the sovereign for Gaza. Israelis will deny it, and many in the Jewish community will deny it. But there's no real debate about that by the great scholars of occupation law like Yoram Dinstein from the University of Tel Aviv, or even by international institutions. International law under the United Nations clearly recognizes Israel as the sovereign in charge of Gaza and of the West Bank and of East Jerusalem. There's no other countries that are sovereign. So these are ethnic Arabs who are under Israeli sovereignty in a sense, or the sovereign rule of an occupying power. And that occupying power has responsibilities to the population it occupies. But again, what happened was it October 7th? That the date of the so-called attack, the terrorist attack? What happened there was, those ethnic Arab Israelis, I'll call them, or Palestinians, broke out. They broke a fence line, as if Israel was not the sovereign of that place, as if these aren't Arab Israelis, as if they're a part of some other sovereign country, and that they're separated by some kind of boundary line between Gaza and Israel proper. No, that's not the case. They're just simply ethnic Arab Palestinians who are under a sort of an apartheid system, ruled by a separate rule of rules than our Jewish Israelis, and they finally, you wonder in a sense why it took so long after being subjugated in such a horrific way. You don't forget all the studies show, and the experts like Finkelstein are much better at this, but all the studies show that Gaza is a place where that is not fit for human habitation. Like we've called it what is it, the world's largest open air prison, but it's
Yeah.
not fit for human beings to live in. And that's what these Arab Israelis, or call them ethnic Arab Palestinians, have been living in. Why did it take them so long to break out
Right.
and militarily resist or fight their condition? That's the irony of it.
Well,
But anyway,
let's okay,
I don't
let's
mean.
so we have time for just one more question. Now this is the Jerusalem Post, not a great source, but the
No,
Saudi crown prince.
it's an irony, isn't it? That
Yes.
it is the Jerusalem Post.
Yes, and so if you could just comment on this. So here, Jerusalem Post writes that the Saudi crown prince, as well as Prime Minister of France, are going to host a conference this summer over the question of Palestinian statehood, and they're going to try to work on diplomatic initiatives of some kind to address this question, this Palestinian statehood question. Now, Will, if you could comment what you think is going to come about, or why do you think, first of all, the Saudis and the French are spearheading this initiative, and secondly, what do you think the outcome of this initiative is going to be?
Yeah, I'm not a news analyst, and I don't follow European the European activities very closely, and I'm certainly not a Middle East expert. I'm not proclaiming myself to be that, but I have studied the minorities question quite in depthly. But in a word, I mean, this is the first international conference on the recognition of a new nation called Palestine. This is absolutely an historic event, because clearly, because there is no international institution by which a peoples, not just Palestinians, but any peoples, can apply to create a country. There has to be some kind of international forum by which the affected peoples or group can apply to help establish the new state. And
Right.
we had this process called Oslo decades ago with regard to Palestine and Israel, and that seems to have totally failed. And this is a new initiative. What's fascinating about this to me politically is it seems to be a response from the peace talks initiated by Donald Trump, who said we need to have peace talks. We need to have the talks on the final status of Gaza and maybe other parts of occupied Palestinian territories. And Trump offered this obnoxious proposal to basically a population transfer of, taking the millions of ethnic Arabs who live in these occupied territories and moving them to other countries with large Arab populations, as opposed to letting them return through the right of return to Israel itself, which is which is what should happen, or to remain in the territories where they're residing currently. But this is the first. This is sort of, to me, a response to Trump's proposal, with a different proposal, but a proposal with tremendous strength. 153 countries apparently have now are recognizing this new initiative. 153 countries, and the Saudis, who the Trump family obviously has very close relationships with, looks like they're spearheading it or sponsoring it, as is France. Why is France important? Well, we are dealing with an area that was largely not Palestine, but other states bordering Palestine under French colonial rule. And I'm referring to Syria and Lebanon. And I was discussing this with someone earlier, taking a wild guess. Maybe the peoples of the area were so fed up with the British for creating this mess with the British Mandatory of Palestine, and I think Iraq also under British control. Maybe they wanted the French in to be European representatives, since obviously there's now a large European the progeny of a large European population, which inhabits these Arab lands, namely European Jewry. And so Europe is so tied to the creation of Israel and Palestine that I guess there needs to be a European component. Also, Europe is tied to the area as the former colonial ruler or power of the area, and so they brought in France. But what an amazing, incredible phenomena to have taken place, that the first international summit on the recognition of the new state of Palestine. I mean, it's on the one hand, one can say, oh, it'll go nowhere, but on the other hand, maybe this will be the ultimate decider of the future of both the Palestinian peoples and also what the future holds for the state of Israel. But
Well, that's
that's
a
a fascinating occurrence. It's
well,
fascinating.
excellent, excellent. Thank you, Will, for sharing your thoughts, your research on minority rights and legal question of international law and statehood. That is all the time we have for today, but we are going to continue to discuss the Palestine question, the minority question, the cultural rights, and all of these very important issues. So thank you guys, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, please leave us a comment, like our channel, subscribe, and go and sign up for our Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I have been your co-host, Jonathan Brown.
Co-host William Barth, thank you very much, John. I enjoyed your questions. I
Yeah,
enjoyed talking about the issue.
thanks for bringing us your insight, Will. And we will see you guys next time. Peace, everyone.
Peace.